Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, we would like to welcome you in our second strategic dialogue of today that is focusing on crucial topic of how media influences strategy in disaster response. My name is Ahmed Abdouli. I'm Sector Director of Media and Databases at ECSSR. As you all know that the media, whether traditional outlets or social media, plays a pivotal role during crisis. It informs the public, shapes perceptions, and at times challenges emergency managers to act swiftly and strategically. So today we are honored to have Dr. Kارlوس Samuel as Assistant Professor specializing in integrated emergency management, who brings a wealth of experience and research into how disaster response interacts with media. Of course, this will help us unpack the challenges, opportunities, and future trends in the field. So before we give the floor to Dr. Kárlوس, we want to ask the audience to prepare their questions to make this session more interactive. So now the floor is yours, Dr. Kárlوس.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. First and foremost, I'd like to extend a note of thanks to you, Mr. Ahmed, ECSSR, and His Excellency. My being here all came about from inadvertently running into His Excellency Dr. Sultan at Yas Mall and having an impromptu conversation, and that delving into some research that I'm undertaking. And the next thing I know, the next day, I received the kind invitation to be here. So it happened all by happenstance. So firstly. So before I go ahead and talk about a little bit about what my initial research looks like, I'd like to actually start by discussing, emergency management as a fundamental practice, as a fundamental discipline. If we look at the field of integrated emergency management, it's any event, any circumstance, any unplanned event that may occur, and it overwhelms the capacity of local officials, local government to be able to respond effectively. And that would warrant the contributions or the support from federal government or other entities in and of itself to be able to supplement the response to that event. Obviously, when we think about integrated emergency management, we see the sirens, we see the damage, we see the destruction, we see the rescue operations taking place. In worst case scenarios, we see the bodies being recovered in more recent events. And obviously that holds merit when we think about emergency management as a discipline and as a practice. But I'd like to start off by stipulating that when we think of the media and what the media's crucial role is in integrated emergency management or disaster response, it doesn't just extend solely to when the sirens go off. When we think about integrated emergency management, I hate to get so technical, but it's a comprehensive cycle. We talk about what we do in steady state times before an impact, before a disaster actually takes place. What we do to prevent, protect, mitigate, prepare for before we're aware that something can actually occur in our community. And so the role of the media is quite essential, right, in what they do in these phases. It's not the most exotic phase. It's not the most captivating and glaring phase. So oftentimes what we do in the prevention stages, which is equally as important to responding to and saving lives. It's very important what the media does, but it goes overlooked. When we think about mitigation, we're doing things like, for example, we're doing risk assessments. We're writing plans. But the media in and of itself does play a very essential role in those areas. If you think about what they can do to heighten public awareness for what's taking place. When we write plans, one of the things we want to do is be able to get or solicit input from citizens about their communities. They live out there. They understand where the flooding takes place, where the hazards are, what areas are most prone to flooding, for example. So when we write those plans, it's essential that we leverage the media and their space, their bandwidth to be able to put those plans out, market those plans, and be able to elicit input or feedback from the public because they're best positioned to be able to inform us. When we think about preparedness and what we do, again, we do exercises, for instance. Again, not the most exotic, not the most captivating thing. We bring people together around the table to talk about resource needs, resource capacity. Again, that's an opportunity for the media to be actively involved. We invite the traditional media to have a role, right? We invite them to be present. They can take it to the nightly news. They can put it on their social media platforms. People tend to watch the media more so than they're watching, what the local crisis management organization is doing. So they have that outreach, they have that space. So that's an opportunity to have sighting of what's taking place in the background. When we think about response, captivating, that's when we think about the media and their role. When we see the event occurs, it's exotic. We tend to want to see, we're enamored, right, by what's happening. Okay, that captivates our attention. And unfortunately, when we think about response, the media's, I guess, for lack of a better term, span of attention can be somewhat limited in some aspects, some disasters. So they can report on the immediacy of what's happening within the first few days of an event. But as time waits and the moments flee, a week passes, they no longer give it coverage, but people are still suffering, right? And those types of events tend to go unnoticed or unreported, and things are still taking place in the background. In recent events, we think about Hurricane Milton in the United States, my home country, that happened in Florida a few weeks ago. You still have individuals who are still suffering, still living in hotels, still living in temporary shelters and so forth, still recovering, right? And still going about their day-to-day lives. But those aspects of disasters tend to go underreported. We tend to think, not in my backyard, it doesn't happen to me, it's not critical to my everyday and so forth, but these events are still taking place. So the media does have a very critical role to ensure that they allocate enough time to those events for an extended duration of time, so to speak. When we think about recovery, which is what we deem to be the final stage of crisis and emergency management, we talk about what do we do to return communities back to normal, back to everyday functioning. In a nutshell, the media also has a very critical role when it comes to recovery. I've seen research, academic research, which talks about we love to think about evacuation. How do we get people away from a disaster area, right, to get them to safety? But one of the areas that tends to be under-researched is return and reentry. How do we get people back into their homes? And that becomes a bit challenging, for instance, because that's an area that's not necessarily underreported, or when it is reported, the media traditional media can sometimes overstate, what the circumstances are, or downplay circumstances in terms of what's happening on the ground. And that's unfortunately, if you look at Australia wildfires, flooding events, we have people who leave their homes and they come back unauthorized. The emergency managers haven't necessarily authorized their return. Authorities haven't authorized their return, and they come back based on media reporting. It looks like things are clear, right? So they come back and they can put themselves in harm's way. So that could be a little bit problematic, so to speak. So what I'm trying to essentially state here is that when we look at the role of the media, right, let's not just focus on the more sensational side of disaster events. Let's think about what they do in everyday times. If you think about the likes of the NCEMAs of the world, the ADCMCs, Local Government Crisis and Emergency Management Center, every day they're playing critical roles, right, in what's stabilizing the resilience of this country through their planning, through their outreach, right, through their collaboration, multi-agency coordination. All of these areas are essentially highly critical to emergency management. So in a nutshell, you, the media, play a very critical role across the landscape of integrated emergency management.
Much, Dr. Samuel, for this informative overview. So let's start with my questions. In your perspective, in what ways does media serve as both ally and a challenge for management during disaster? So, if you give us your own perspective on that.
Yeah, absolutely. The media definitely plays a quite critical role in emergency management. Emergency management is very multifaceted. We don't just think of the role of the media. We think of things like search and rescue. We think of things like evacuation, logistics, medical care, and so on. We can go on and on, right? What those types of operational activities are. The media is just one critical segment of it. In terms of what their essential part they play in disaster response, situational awareness by way of their reporting, being out in the field, being on the ground. They have built trust with the wider population over a period of time. So they have the eye. They're able to more readily captivate the attention of the public at large, to provide situational awareness, what's happening in real time. The other thing that they can do is, sometimes in emergency management, we tend to use very technical jargon, okay? That doesn't always go over very well with the wider public. When we think about things like a damage assessment, that's, okay, we may know what that means, but the broader public may not necessarily understand what that means. When we say a storm is X amount of nautical miles away from landfall, that may not be essentially something that the people can readily consume, right? It doesn't resonate with them. The media can simplify certain language to say 2 hours or less, right? So that can be something that they can help do, is provide situational awareness in addition to being able to simplify language as it relates to disaster response. Other areas that the media is very essential is we've seen in past disasters, for example, Hurricane Harvey in the United States, Hurricane Milton. They're very good at how they frame what's happening. They can speak to sort of what the disposition is of the population at large, people in need of evacuation, a single mother in a home with her children, an elderly couple stuck in their home, unable to evacuate. And that tends to galvanize the community, right? That tends to galvanize them into action. So they're able, by way of their framing what's happening on the ground real time, that can essentially create a level of mobility by everyday citizens. And I'd like to say, why do we see the mobilization of citizens? There are two quite divergent approaches to emergency management. We say that when a crisis happens, there's a lot of instability. It's very chaotic, a lot of uncertainty. And the only way to bring a level of stability to that is to inject bureaucracy. It's very top-down, rules, rigidity, etc. And that can oftentimes be very challenging because the disaster is very fast-paced, it's very fast-moving. Things are happening at an unprecedented level. We can speak about what we experienced here earlier this year in Dubai with the major floods, unfortunately, that we experienced. And things were very fast-moving, right? Despite the fact that we understood the broader picture of what was taking shape, things are very fast-moving. And media reporting was able to, again, capture the images of what was taking place, what was unfolding, right? And that gives an indication to, for instance, Dubai Police or volunteer organization and what was taking shape, right? So they're able to mobilize volunteers in that aspect. One example that comes to mind is Dubai Airport. Okay, for those of us that lived there, we saw the stories and so forth, how it was reported that things were overrun, how many hundreds of flights were canceled, how many thousands of passengers were stuck at the airport. And so one of the things that happened as a result of that reporting is that we saw large-scale mobilization of volunteers, right? Which was more emergent, which brings me to the other way that we tend to look at disasters in emergency management. That very top-down, very rigid rules and protocols. We also have a very ad hoc. We respond to needs as they emerge. And that's something that we saw happening here, right? As things were unfolding, we saw a mobilization of volunteers. Social media, things were being placed on social media, on X, on WhatsApp. A mother stuck in a high-rise, or a couple stuck in a high-rise with an elderly parent unable to transcend 30 flights of stairs. And what do? And we saw large-scale mobilization of volunteers being able to go into action to provide essential support, critical support to these individuals in the midst of what was unfolding real time. So in a nutshell, what we see in terms of the criticality of what media can do, again, they're able to frame stories, they're able to simplify stories, they're able to mobilize resources, and they're able to provide us situational awareness about what's happening in the field that can inform the response of our local first responders.
Doctor, as you came from academic background, so could you please share with us an example or research or experience where an effective media coordination led a better disaster outcomes? If you share us some of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I spoke earlier about the various hurricanes which have happened over the last nearly decade in the United States. And based on media reporting, we've seen with the volunteer activity, the volunteer action, how that's been able to unfold because of media reporting, right? So media is a very good conduit, a very good channel to be able to relay information in real time. On the flip side of that, I know it's not essentially your question, but on the flip side of that, there could be certain challenges, right, as it relates to how the media reports certain things. If we look at how language is framed, for example, that could have implications for how us as the broader public view an event. Give you an example. You've had events where the media reporting has been, this is going to be catastrophic, devastating, unprecedented, unexpected, death and destruction expected. Something happens, but it's not to the extent or the magnitude that we anticipated it being, right? So what does that do? How does that ingrain? How is that cemented into the mind of the population? If that event doesn't manifest, we don't want it to manifest into anything. But what I'm saying is, if we ingrain those images, that language into the minds of individuals, and nothing extreme comes of it, what happens the next time we use that language, right? People become somewhat desensitized to that. In one ear, out the next. It falls by the wayside and so forth. So I think there needs to be sort of a way how the media can look at how language is framed. Another instance is going way back, Hurricane Katrina in the United States. That was 2005. A large number of individuals were afflicted. The federal government, the local government were non-existent for days on end in the immediate aftermath of that event. And people had to fend for themselves. Individuals had to, dare I say, go into stores and help themselves to food. If I have an elderly family member, I go into a pharmacy, yeah, it's closed, it's boarded up, but this is survival. And the media comes in and they may frame that as looting or criminal behavior. Well, what is it really? Is it survival or is it criminal behavior, right? So sometimes that language can have consequences. It definitely can. So based on how it's framed, we have to think about, number one, how does the language essentially resonate and influence future behavior or future actions of individuals? And number two, how does that create a wider perception of how we view how citizens respond to events based on media language?
Thank you. I'll now open the floor for audience. If anyone wants to have a go to ask questions, please, you can raise your hand.
What are some guidelines that you can give for media outlets when they are receiving information that might be firsthand or a hot take on something? What are some of the things that we can keep in mind before we publish or before we post? How can we decide if this is going to be helpful or a hindrance in the, even if it is a disaster, in the progress that can be made? So how can we determine if what we have to share is going to be for the betterment and not for more of the detriment?
Excellent. That's a great question. We always say trust but verify. Trust but verify that information. So as a non-government official entity and so forth, before you post something, we always say before you put it on social media, verify from multiple sources, for example. That's one thing that we're seeing a lot of emergency management offices doing from this point on, right? They may see posts on social media, for example, but before they go ahead and take action on it, which could result in the misallocation of resources if something isn't necessary, there's no veracity to it, right? We trust but verify. Is that information coming from multiple sources, for instance? Is it being reported by a volume of sources? Is it in the plurality of what we're seeing? Okay, yes. Okay, then that may be something that's credible that we have to maybe act on. So that's one thing that I can say. Other things that we can do, we ensure that we use different platforms, for example, not just social media. You know, we have field personnel, we have operational personnel. Can that be validated, right? Based on what we're seeing on social media, is that able to be validated based on other sources of information that we are receiving and so forth? We're also seeing things like different types of technology being used to be able to supplement information that we're seeing in social media. For instance, drone technology. That's something that's being used a lot. CCTV. We have cameras everywhere, so that allows us insight into what's actually happening on the ground. So when we're seeing information on social media, there are other platforms or other streams that we can incorporate to be able to validate the accuracy of information.
Any more questions from the audience? So I'll have one. As media technology evolve, how can emergency management, you think, Dr. Carlos, stay ahead of trends to improve disaster response?
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that I always emphasize is, based on I won't bore you with the whole histrionics of emergency management and how it came across. It's very paramilitary, right? We look at it, we need police, we need military, and rightfully so. But one of the things that we're starting to see is that a lot of civilians are tending to enter into the emergency management resilience discipline. People who have degrees in a variety of different fields, media, journalism, crisis communication, engineering. So they provide different perspectives, right? So that gives a more holistic look, a holistic pillar to emergency management. So I think bringing in those different perspectives, that tends to create different voices in the room, so to speak. And that's one way I think that emergency management can continue to evolve, is not just rely solely on one dimension, on one type of emergency management professional to be able to sustain the field. Other things, I know AI is a very hot topic going on now. That's an important tool that we're starting to see with emergency management, how it's being used. Through things such as crowdsourcing, emergency managers are beginning to utilize that information. We're pulling information off of different social media platforms. We're using AI to be able to extract themes from what we're seeing people are responding to, what they're saying is happening on the ground. And that allows us to create a level of accuracy to information. If we're able to extract information from various social media platforms, and we're able to utilize AI to be able to mine and crowdsource that data, that allows us to come up with certain themes and give us a level of confidence that the information that's being reported from out in the field coming to us is actually accurate to a high extent.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Carlos Samuel, for your informative insights that you have raised. Today's conversation highlighted the media is not just a tool, it's a powerful force in disaster response, as you have mentioned, from transparency to trust building to combating misinformation. So the key takeaways from our discussions could be leveraging social media for real-time updates while mitigating its risks, the need for proactive engagement and media literacy training for both public and emergency responders, the importance of collaboration between media outlets and emergency managers to ensure accurate, impactful communication during crisis. Thank you, Dr. Samuel, for your contributions, and thank you so much.